outrage over the death of a rape victim in Uttar Pradesh's Hathras, the National Crime Records Bureau 2019 report revealed how common crimes against women witnessed a steep rise across the country. As per the horrifying statistics, every 16 minutes a woman is raped somewhere in India, and every 4 minutes women experience cruelty at the hands of her in-laws. In 2019, the country had reported 88 cases every day. Of the total 32,033 cases reported in the year, 11% were from the Dalit community. To discuss this and more, we have with us writer and media consultant Tara Kaushal, who is also the author of Why Men Rape, India's first such investigative report. So, thank you so much for joining. What are your views on the developments Hathras as of now?
Well, clearly this is a caste-based atrocity, and anyone who tells you differently is a privileged idiot. Rape and sexual violence against women has been used historically to keep not only women in check, but also their communities. And, we know that in patriarchy, the honor of a family rests in a victim's vagina, in the woman's vagina. So this is a perfect way of suppressing a community and asserting power. And that's clearly what this was about. And if you read some of the stuff that's being said, this man, the accused, the prime accused, Eve teased the victim. And I use Eve tease carefully. I don't like the word, but it's been shared in the media. Sexually harassed the victim, prevented her from going out of the house, which is all functions of sexual terrorism that work not only towards the women, but towards their community at large. So yeah, Hathras is something that we need to keep in public consciousness because it doesn't fit the narrative that we like in the media, in the mainstream media, which is that, it's these monstrous lower caste, lower class men lurking in the bushes, waiting for a Savarna virgin to chance along. That's certainly is not what happened here. And so it's very important to talk about this kind of caste-based violence, this kind of class violence, which is not what the public consciousness is about rape. So I think it's a difficult crime. It's also important to keep the caste angle in the forefront without sharing the victim's name. And I know a lot of people, some people, of course, have been sharing it with impunity because they don't see the dynamics behind keeping a victim's name away from the media. But there are other people who are well-intentioned and are sharing it because they want to keep the caste angle in the forefront. But I still insist we shouldn't be using her name because it's not our right to, further a movement on at the cost of her family and her cost. So I think that's what I think about the Hathras case.
What was in your mind when you decided to author a book on why men rape?
Well, so I was raped when I was 4 or 5 by a gardener. But because my parents didn't know about this, there were no changes to my freedom or my lifestyle or any of those things. But later on, when we moved to Noida, when I was 12 years old, and we moved from naval bases, which are considered safe spaces. So we've moved from the naval base in Bombay to Noida as civilians. And suddenly my parents were really interested in my hemlines and my deadlines. And I think the question that I started asking then as a 12-year-old baby feminist, which is, why do the actions of men impact my life? And why can't they stop? Why is it, preventing me from doing the things I want to do? I think that eventually led to the book that I've written 25 years later. But of course, the more immediate impetus came from the Delhi gang rape. I was a college student who went to Delhi University by bus. So it could have been me from 10 years before. But also it was a realization that nothing had changed. I experienced, daily molestation in the Delhi buses and nothing had changed. So in 2013 is when I started, reading for this book and planning for it and saving for it. And in 2017 is when I took it on full time. And I went undercover with 9 men who have raped.
So, what was the research process like, and how did you figure out whom to interview?
So I went undercover once I decided that that was the route that I was going to take, which is to go undercover and meet men pretending to be a film researcher so I could understand, all of them. Because what tends to happen is when you do research within jails, which is where most research on men who have raped, but criminals in general happens, you see only a certain section of society. And as we know, a certain section of society bears the brunt of the law a lot more than others. You also don't examine these men in the context of their homes and families and the women who love them. So it was important for me to actually meet these men in their social context. Once I decided this was what I wanted to do, the first thing I did was, seek, I seek victims from my Facebook, and then through them seek out their perpetrators. But shortly after, I realized that it was a feeling that I had before I started, but it crystallized as I was going forward, that gender violence follows class lines. And by this, I mean that men of the highest socioeconomic strata have access to women of their class and below. And so while I didn't want to promote the Kapoor idea of rapists, these men who had victimized women of my social class were men of our social class as well. And so these were not representative of India either. So I looked at a couple of men from this social strata, and then for men of other social stratas, I got to them through the police, through local NGOs, through detective agencies, through the local media, and eventually ended up finding men across social strata in the country.
So, what kind of effort did it take to be non-judgmental and not hate them while interviewing?
Part of me feels that while the going undercover was necessary from a strategic point of view, I also feel that it ended up being better for my mental health because I was in character. And there was a bit of distance between Tara Kaushal, who was just horrified at the things that were being told to her, and this character who was saying, "Acha, phir kya hua?" And "Aur batao," when these men were kind of talking about gender violence. So it took a bit, there was a bit of distance. Having said that, it's not like there has been no emotional impact of having heard all of these things. Because on the one hand, when I started the project, women were coming to me and telling me unsolicited their stories of gender violence. And I was ready to receive that. But on the other hand, I was also hearing men who have raped, tell me their stories of not only the atrocities that they had committed, but also of the atrocities that they had been subjected to. So all of it did take a toll. And I would say I was depressed twice during the project, one 9 months in and the other about a year and a half in. And now that the lockdowns happened, I realized that there's a lot of angst that is coming out and coming to the surface. So I'm in therapy now to deal with all of it.
Can you share some of your findings from your research?
Um, there are several ways to look at gender violence, and the one of the positions that I have investigated is that, you know, when you talk about gender violence, you usually say that a man objectifies his victim. And that's why you keep trying to make this person a human being, see them as human beings. And that's why you say, you know, Bollywood, we should change Bollywood, we should change the way Bollywood has sexualized and objectified women. And this comes from an older way of looking at gender violence. And the older way of looking at violence and gender violence is that this is the cause. In order for violence to proceed, you must dehumanize the person. But a newer way of looking at at violence and gender violence, and when I say newer, I mean like this theory is only about 10 years old, is that perpetrators are fully aware that their victims are people, that their victims feel pain. And the joy of causing pain comes from the understanding that these are people that hurt. So it's the exact opposite theory of the first way of looking at gender violence. And my only and humble contribution to this whole dialogue, because I think if you've read the book, I've said it in the book that I'm not a researcher, I'm a writer, and my role, as I saw it, was to just take conversations that were very nuanced in the academic sphere and bring them into regular conversation through a interesting mass book. But my humble contribution to the whole discourse on gender violence is that both theories are true. When there is rape that is for sex of a wife or whatever, where there's no anger or violence involved, where a man is looking at it and saying, look, it's a choice between my desires and hers, that's patriarchy and that's objectification. But where there is violence and power issues involved and anger involved, at that point, the victim is seen as fully human and somebody who needs to be taught a lesson. So these are interesting factors, that power and patriarchy overlap in some really strange ways. And of course, we have Bollywood and the media that normalizes a certain treatment of women and victims in that sense. And these are also contributing factors to gender violence.
So, whenever there's a rape, there are two things that come to the forefront, two discussions. One is that women should learn self defense, and the other is capital punishment. Do you think these things help?
I'm going to address the self-defense one because capital punishment is a long rant. I have the same issue with self-defense as I do with general protectionism. You know, when parents say, don't go out at night, it's not safe. It is that on the one hand, you need to balance the reality of the situation. And on the other hand, you know, why should women be bearing the brunt of men's actions? So why should I learn self-defense? Let's focus a little bit more on teaching men and boys not to rape, no? So I understand the practical considerations of self-defense. I think it's important. But I don't think it's a solution. Also, because self-defense is based on the premise that, you know, there was violence and many men and you have to run, which is the stranger danger idea of gender violence, which has been kind of disproved. It's people you love and trust and, you know, marital rape, all of these things. It's very hard to say that self-defense is the answer to more nuanced rape. Of course, stranger danger and 5 men in a bus and, you know, Shakti Kapoor lurking in the bushes, sure, self-defense will help. But I think the onus of change needs to be put back on the boys and the men of the country. Secondly, about capital punishment. I don't think capital punishment works at all. And in fact, I believe that capital punishment will serve to increase rapes and murders. Because if you rape someone and you know you're going to die, odds are you'll probably think, look, maybe the police, if she can't identify me, maybe the police will not catch me. So I think it's going to increase rape and murder. The other thing is, we presume, again, that all rapes are these stranger danger monster people. But it's not true. 95% of rapes are committed by someone known to the victim. And this is also true in child sexual abuse. So when the Madhya Pradesh government in 2018 said, death for all child rapists, it seemed like an interesting, prima facie, lots of people were rejoicing. It seemed like the correct move. But that's, again, okay when it's stranger danger. When it's your uncle or your chacha or your grandfather who's committing the rape, will parents report it knowing that this man will go to the gallows? Will judges convict? Because we've seen this happen with the Nirbhaya, with the Justice Verma committee, which came upon after the Nirbhaya case. We've seen this happen where when you set a minimum of 7 years for any sort of rape, and rape as a definition has gotten wider, then judges are more reluctant to convict for what they consider minor offenses. So that's the other factor. And I think capital punishment also ignores intersectionality. And there's no case that explains intersectionality as well as this one. A few years ago, there was this woman who reported her father for raping her. And so the media descended in this little village in UP or Bihar or whatever. And it was all good until a few days later, I read that the mother had come out in support of the father, the man who had raped her daughter. And then one journalist asked the mother, saying, how can you do this? How can you support this man? And she said, look, tum journalist to chale jaoge. I have 6 kids, and he's the only earning member of the family. Who will support me and them once he is put to death? So I don't think capital punishment works at all. And that's actually the gist of it from a legal point of view. Of course, I have ethical and moral issues, but that's perhaps not for this conversation. But really, from a legal point of view, capital punishment is not the answer at all.
That also reminds me of one of Nirbhaya's rapists saying that if you put us to death, then rapes won't stop, but more girls would be killed.
Yeah, and this was practical, right? And we're talking about the interview in India's Daughter. I think that's the one you're talking about, where he also says that, in a previous generation, if you rape a girl, she'll just keep quiet, she'll be shy. But now that she's going to the police, and now that women are encouraged to go to the police, and now that there's death sentence on the table, men will perhaps think twice about letting their victims live.
Right. So what is the caste angle to gender violence?
So the framework that I have used to kind of look at men and men who rape in the country is a framework of class. And caste and religion and education and location and culture, all of them are factors of what I've called social class in India. Now, caste as a factor of class, as I have mentioned in the book, plays a big role. Now, on the one hand, men of higher classes, and therefore usually higher castes, are given the benefit of the doubt. they also have access to women of their classes and below. And therefore, and what I mean by this is that's the norm, that you will be raped by someone in your class, and subversion happens. 5 men capturing a woman in her bus is subversion, because there's an imbalance of power, and therefore there is subversion. Or you look at domestic helps um, sexually abusing children, again an imbalance of power. But usually sexual violence happens top down, and so caste tends to play a really big role in determining class, and class determines how much access men have to how many women. So men, the Me Too variety of men, the uppermost of the uppermost class, have a very have access to a lot of women, and we've seen this through the Shiny Ahuja case. That's a case in point, where there was a circumstance where this man is a trusted member of society and he is left alone with a woman. But the reverse is rarely ever true. We are rarely ever, upper class women are usually in our golden cages. So the gender violence, the oppressions that are intersectional and interlinked for lower caste women are a lot more than women of our classes encounter. So caste as an element of class, and that's how I've used it in the book, but of course caste exists as a power structure of its own. Caste as an element of class plays a huge role in the level of entitlement men feel, and to what kind of women.
What was the experience of launching your book and in the middle of a pandemic?
Oh, so I would say there's been a lot of loss on that front. This was my first book. I wanted to be a writer since I was 6 years old, and I'm 37. So I've worked on this book for 7 years. So this was not how I expected my launch day to be. I did not expect to be cleaning my kitty litter and doing bartans. That's not how it was planned. So I did miss the signings and the meetings and the greetings and the book tour. The other thing I realized has the other negative, other bad news, was that a lot of translations and other derivatives of the book, which would have naturally come from such a successful launch and so many great reviews that the book has received, I realized, I was told recently by my publisher that a lot of the language publishers are struggling, are economically, because of the repercussions of economic slowdown and the lockdown, they're really struggling. So the number of translation requests we have received has been less than what we expected. But I would say the only good thing that has come, and I guess it has longer term effects than the meetings and the greetings that I lost immediately. The good thing that has happened has been the insane media coverage. Because I really think, the book's great, I have to say. I'm not being falsely modest. But I feel that when pre-publicity started on the 9th of May, the media was so hungry for non-corona content that anything like where I was, if you were, for instance, a woman's magazine, I would have maybe got one piece of coverage. But now there was no fashion, there was nothing. So there was like 4 pieces of coverage where there would have maybe been one. Likewise with literary magazines. So there have been positives and negatives, but that's how it is. That's the world today.
So before we end this, what are the long-term and short-term solutions to gender violence, according to you?
So I think of course, smash the patriarchy, dismantle the patriarchy. And that comes with being culturally liberal. I think that is truly a solution. Um, I also think, I know this sounds really hippies chale gaye, mujhe chhod gaye, but I do feel that love is a very big factor in changing the way men see women. And we're a culture in India and globally, we're a culture of hate. We do not like people holding hands, but we are happy to see people, show road rage in public. So we are a culture of hate. We don't encourage love or romance. And I really think that is the answer. And going back to what I talked about earlier, whether you, so whether you look at it as as objectification as a cause of rape, or personification as a cause of rape. I'll use marital rape as an example. If you actually love your wife, it's much harder for you to objectify her and say, she doesn't want it, but it's cool. I'm the guy. So it's much harder for you to objectify. It's also harder for you to express rage through violence and through sexual violence and rape. So I do think we need to take a foot off the caste-based anger. And our political climate and capitalism both encourage anger and discontent and unhappiness. But we need to focus a little bit more on making, on prioritizing love, romantic and otherwise. And if you ask me, the smallest thing that we can actually advocate for that will change the way men and boys look at violence is we need to prioritize eliminating corporal punishment and domestic violence at homes. Because boys, if they are hit or they see their mother getting hit, they develop a very unhealthy relationship between violence and power, violence and love. It's an understanding that, that's what people in love do. That's what, my father loves me and he hits me. And so when I love someone, it'll be okay for me to also be violent. They also think that that's what powerful people do. And it makes, violence becomes intergenerational, and rape is one of the consequences. So if we actually want to look at something small, let's focus on the men and the boys. Let's encourage NGOs that work with men and boys. And let's work towards eliminating domestic violence and corporal punishment.